Directionality. The traditional system lacks directionality. So a major third is always assumes to go forward 4 semitones. Now again, I'm sure that if you're playing the guitar, you have an issue with this, or any kind of instrument, because basically we're imagining our intervals are usually defined as though we're on a clock face, meaning they're going to repeat even as we go up the octaves. Now we could use compound intervals. We'll talk about that issue later, but usually most people, particularly on the guitar, treat all the intervals as though we're on one octave within the clock face, and it just keeps on going around in a circle. But we typically only name them going clockwise around the circle. Now notice if you're on a block, if you're saying, I'm going to go around the block, there's 12 points on the block or 7 actual destination locations that I stop on my trip around the block. If I go 4 steps in one direction, then I can go 12 minus 4 steps in the opposite direction around the block to get to the same point. The current system doesn't really have a naming convention for going negative distance around the block. That becomes a problem. There's no natural language to describe one step backwards. So in the modal distance system, we have symmetry. Now, if we say, for example, that we're going to go -1i, and I'm going to call that negative flows through to the negative first modal half step backwards, which would be the second scale degree, then you have 1 half step backward from the Ionian or major node. So in other words, what does this term mean? This would be going backwards 1 half step. So if I'm on the C here and I go backwards 1 half step, I get to the B. In terms of my notes this way, if I'm on the C, the B would be above it, or I go around in a circle to the B if I go backwards 1 half step from what I'm going to call the Ionian node, which is going to be the map on our point, which is going to be our C in this case, and it's going to be 1 modal half step backwards, which would be, if I'm on this B and I went backwards, 1 modal half step out of the 7 note collection. Now, what if we had a scale degree? On a scale degree terminology, if I went 1 note backwards, it would be 1 scale degree backwards. So you would think it would be a -2nd scale degree. In other words, if I'm on the C and I go forward 1 scale degree and I use that as my unit of measure of the 1, this would be the 2 or the 2nd. If I go backwards, then you would think that the B would be a -2nd scale degree. But we don't usually do -2nd scale degrees. We actually dropped the scale degree terminology completely, in part because it's not symmetrical. It doesn't really make sense to go backwards and say it's a -2nd scale degree, because you would think that you can figure out 7 minus 2 to kind of get to the positive directionality, but you can't, because they messed up the measurement term, because this should be 0.0 and you measure from it. Instead, they used scale degrees. In other words, if I used this terminology, a -1 from the Ionian node and then a -1 modal half step backwards, which should be the -2nd scale degree, then 12 minus 1 would be 11 steps forward. So this would be equivalent to going around the block 11 steps clockwise, 1 step counterclockwise, or this is a -1 step back, because that negative flows through. If I go 1 step modal half step back, that would be equivalent to 7 minus 1, or 6 modal half steps forward, which would be the 7th scale degree, right? So this makes symmetrical sense. You can't make symmetrical sense on a scale degree going backwards, because the measurement is off and it gets all messed up. So if you go backwards, it's a mess. So it's equivalent to an 11 note away Ionian 6, which would be the 7th scale degree. So we can just use simple math to go around the block one way, which has 12 points, versus going around the block the other way, which has 7 points around the block. So here's the issue. If I'm on the fretboard here, let's say I'm on this G and I want to measure to this D. So what's the distance? There's a distance of 5 between the strings typically. We'll talk more about that later, but 5, 6, 7. So I have a distance of 7 notes going up this way. And what would I call that? If it's a distance of 7, typically we're going to call that a 7 note away perfect fifth. But what if I count from this point, counting this way? Then I get a 1, 2, plus 5, or a -7. there's a -7 distance. But notice we don't normally say, there's no term to say -7. So what you have to do is kind of take the inverse distance, and I'd say, okay, well, 12 minus 7 is going to be a distance of 5. So if I measure from this D to this G, I'm going to call it a 5-note away, which would be a perfect fourth, even though that doesn't exactly make sense, because you can clearly see that the difference between these two is 7. Either positive, you can think of this as +7 versus -7, right? So it like because of the kink of the tuning, this is a 5-note distance here, or you could see it like here. If I was on this D and I went down, that would be 5 notes. That would be a 5-note away distance. But going from this D backwards, that's a -7-note away distance. So I would think from a practical standpoint, then you start to want to use the -7 and say, well, if I went back a -7 distance, could be a perfect fifth, and a perfect fifth would be forward 5. So in other words, I would say from a practical standpoint, and you're using normal intervals, you want to remember both directions for both of the intervals, meaning a perfect fifth is either 5 notes forward or it's 7 notes backwards. But again, that's not how most people kind of use the terminology. They only think about the terminology as though we're going clockwise around the clock and not negative clockwise. So they're still going to say, like, this is a perfect, from here to here is like a perfect fifth, even though we're going backwards a -7 distance. We're going to think of it as though we went clockwise around the clock. All right, that's a problem. Notice that if you use the current art notation, we don't have that problem, because you can clearly then have directionality and you can still apply the concept of modal half steps without having that issue due to the fact that you started on a 1 instead of a 0.